On last week's show, we previewed Anthony Fauci's testimony in the House this week. And now, of course, that testimony has taken place. And I think we might have been a little bit too optimistic in what might happen there. And our optimism was guided, of course, by the House questioning a guy called David Morans, who was Fauci's senior advisor for 20 years. And he had appeared before the House a couple of weeks earlier. And, well, the House totally picked him apart and he completely fell apart. And all the lies about COVID's origin and the cover up and everything came out. So we were kind of hopeful that that might happen again. And instead, we got the exact opposite. What did you make of it?
Well, I guess first of all, I noticed the same pattern that we saw before, and that was that the questioning from the representatives themselves, the members of Congress, for the most part was kind of shit. Yeah, there was some kind of showiness to it occasionally, but for the most part, it got better when the staffers came on. That's what happened in the Morans thing. That seemed like that also happened with Fauci in this case. But I guess I felt like I kind of knew we were in trouble when the hearing opened, and I was watching the whole thing live and sending some tweets about it. And immediately, Brad Wenstrup, can't say his name, opens up the hearing, and it almost sounds like he's kowtowing to Fauci and thanking him profusely for being here, etc. It was this long, awful, gratuitous preamble, and it was that moment I'm like, oh man, this whole thing is going to go badly. Right from the get-go.
I had the same reaction, and it was the vaccines in particular. He was just profusely thanking him for the vaccine and saving all these lives and so on. And of course, that ties in exactly with one of the issues we had suggested that they talk about, which is the fact that we've talked about a lot, but specifically on the previous show, that Fauci had basically mobilized for mass vaccine production on January 13th, 2020. And then that never came up.
Well, and juxtaposed with the fact that he was publicly downplaying COVID while he was privately gearing up an army for COVID, in terms of the mRNA side. So that was an area that I thought we both thought they should have really focused on, and we got nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back kind of to the beginning here, both in terms of the hearing and in terms of the timeline. I think it's kind of important, or it might be useful, to just go through some of the things, that happened in real life, but then that were not addressed in this hearing. So I think we got to start in 2011, because what is often forgotten, and in a way, it might be the most important point out of the entire COVID saga, is that Fauci was the one who pushed gain of function in 2011. And it was Fauci who said in 2011 that it was a risk worth taking. And he wasn't talking in general terms about general experiments or whatever. He was talking specifically about the kinds of experiments that led to COVID, namely giving a virus, a SARS virus, an extra function, making it somehow more deadly, more transmissible. And then supposedly that could help you develop a vaccine. And that's why he said, yeah, there's a risk. He said this in 2011. Again, he said it was a risk worth taking. And the risk is it's going to leak out of the lab and, going to kill all these people. But it's worth taking because you're going to get a vaccine out of it. Well, we got the leak, but we didn't get the vaccine.
Yeah. And again, put it in on paper. That was an op-ed, a risk worth taking. And, it's maybe people are becoming more aware now, but it's been a lifelong quest of Fauci to have this mass vaccine trial. I'm sure when this actually happened, he was perfectly giddy about the whole prospect of everything. But that also kind of gels into everything that it kind of epitomizes COVID. You've got this sort of public pre-COVID opinion from all of these top virologists or top health officials, and then you've got their sudden post-COVID opinion. We saw that with Hotez leaps to mind, thinking about his position in regards to trying to ascertain these high risk areas, and then what he thought about it afterwards, and trying to find laboratory leaks. And then he claims there basically couldn't have been a laboratory leak. We've seen these contradictory positions time and again from these people pre-COVID, post-COVID. And again, none of that was highlighted.
Right. So they never asked him about the fact that he was the world's most powerful person in his position in terms of being able to fund this stuff in terms of sitting over many, many billions of dollars worth of money that he could just dole out in 2011 who pushed this stuff. So in many ways, he's the most responsible because he started this and he was the one pushing it. Many people are pushing it. Scientists, were pushing it and so on, but he was the most powerful one. He was never asked about it. Okay, then we move along. Then we had the moratorium, the Obama moratorium on gain of function. And again, he wasn't really asked about that at all because there's a very specific thing that happened during the moratorium, which of course was that the work was outsourced to China, specifically the SARS work via EcoHealth, that shady organization. And there was a guy at NIH, at NIAID, who very rightly identified this as being in violation. And that guy is called Eric Stemme. And he put a stop to that money flow. And Fauci's office turned the money back on. And that we never got any answers to that. I mean, we have the emails. He should have been absolutely just grilled on that. That never happened. And then HOTES, as you mentioned, that's 2015 as well. So Fauci gave HOTES $1.2 million to develop a vaccine in case there's a lab leak. Oh, and then of course HOTES was involved with Zhao Yuzhen. That's another thing that wasn't talked about. Then Barrick wasn't talked about. That's 2015 as well. Barrick and Xi Jinping, the director.
I don't know. Did Barrick's name come up once during the hearing? I didn't hear it. I don't think it did.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to
take godfather of gain of function? How do you have a hearing on this and not to discuss Barrick? And the fact that Fauci lied about knowing Barrick, provably lied about knowing Barrick.
Yep, they never asked about that either. And of course, the fact that Barrick had in fact made a virus, a SARS virus, more it made it so that it could infect humans. And in fact, in the paper they wrote in 2015, this is the Wuhan lab and Ralph Barrick, they said this SARS virus, which they created in the lab, was poised for human emergence. I mean, this is literally exactly what gain of function is.
Well, and not only that, that's the paper that set off Fauci. When that paper started to come to light inadvertently through John Cohen's science article, that is the paper that threw Fauci into action to have the secret teleconference in the first place, where he's being reactive to the fact that, oh yes, he actually did fund gain of function. That's what set everything in motion.
That's right. During the moratorium, that happened. So it's quite unbelievable that they didn't push him on any of those things. Now, some of them pushed him on the definition of gain of function, and he did a sort of his normal trick of just swapping things out. So he then used a later definition of gain of function, which was not in force in 2015, 14, 15, 16, when all these things with Barrick, Xi Jinping, HOTES, and so on were taking place. And no one said, hey, hold on. This is not gain of function. We have a definition of gain of function, which, by the way, the NIH provided. We have a letter where they confirmed what the definition is in 2016. And that definition is a very simple one. It's what we just said. You just make a virus more transmissible and more deadly, more transmissible. It gains a function. It's very simple. It was a very simple definition. And
the NIH left that definition alone for a long time. And then suddenly after COVID, they're chasing the definition, changing it a couple different times.
Right. And no one called him on that. No one said, hey, stop it, Fauci. We have a definition. It's here, 2016. Your people wrote it down for us.
We have your definition. Yeah.
Exactly. And according to your definition, the EcoHealth grant was turned off in 2016. Now, of course, this is hugely important because if it had stayed turned off, then we might not be talking about any of this because it might not have happened at all.
Yep. One of the things first of all, in a generalized sense, I guess the thing that upset me the most, and it's something you and I talked about heading into this, is the fact that we've got all of this evidence against Fauci from FOIA, emails, etc. This whole case that you have to have China's cooperation to prove it was a lab leak. We disproved that a long time ago. That's factually untrue. But, we were making the case that, look, you've got to use his own emails against him. You've got to come prepared. And the GOP showed up and they didn't do any of that. There should have been exhibits that were put out on, up on boards where the public would see them. Here's your email on X date, highlighted, underlined, all ready to go. And once again, the GOP just showed up unintentionally prepared, is the words that I used in a tweet. And I stand by that. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. Unintentionally prepared.
You could have played back videos. So, for instance, he kept repeating this lie that he never covered anything up. He always had an open mind. He always thought it was, equally possible, or at least, very likely that it could have come from either, blah, blah, blah. He just kept repeating that. Well, why didn't I have a video ready just to put up for everyone, just a little, cut of all his claims back in 2020?
They should have just run a 20-second, 30-second montage.
Yeah, where he kept
Let
saying,
him
no,
say
100%
that,
natural.
and then just go, really, isn't that interesting? Well, we'd like to have you watch this screen right here and play it and let it go. One of the things that has always driven me bananas, because it's such an easy point and it proves so much. For people who, Fauci and his whole crew established the natural origin kind of unofficially on February 1st on that teleconference. And what they've told the people, what they've said publicly after they got caught, is they said, well, we changed our mind over a period of months. It was a gradual evolution into this new opinion. Well, the problem with that is that's demonstrably false. And the reason I say that, February 1st, they had the teleconference, they established natural origin. They've already begun writing proximal origin at the time of the teleconference. Proximal origin is used to promote a natural origin, which again is going diametrically against what they believe happened. They believe it was a lab leak. 2 days later, they go before NASM, the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine. They get called in by NASM because NASM is trying to provide an answer to the origin of COVID to the White House. NASM reaches out to experts. Now, not surprising, they reach out to Fauci. He comes in with the same group of scientists, and they all tell NASM it was a natural origin. 2 days after the teleconference. So this whole argument that they evolved into a natural origin theory over a period of months, it's right there in writing. They met with the NASM officials and they told them they thought it was a natural origin. 2 days after the teleconference, where they were all talking internally and saying this is a lab leak and it's an engineered virus. Not a peep.
And by the way, they didn't ask him a question that we've all had for a long time, which is, what exactly did he tell them on February 3rd at the NASM call? Because we only know it indirectly, but we haven't got him on record saying what he told them. Now, we know that he told them it was 100% natural. That's why he brought all these proximal frauds to back him up on that. But again, they should have just pinned him down on that.
Well, and we've got all the emails that surround that meeting as well, where they're very clearly talking about some emails saying, hey, we need to make sure, they were trying to pressure NASM's director to push a natural origin. We literally have those emails. So there's no lack of clarity as to what happened. And the fact that there wasn't a single question on that sequence is just astonishing.
I just want to go back here a year or so, because, we've gone through the timeline up to this point, and we've sort of skipped ahead to 2020, but there's some things that happened in 2019, which he also wasn't asked about. So I think the first one, which is so hugely important, is that the database was taken offline by the Wuhan lab in mid-September of 2019. Anyone with, two functioning brain cells can work out that is when it happened, around that, just before that time, because that's just the Chinese modus operandi, especially under the CCP. That's just how it works. You have a big cock up in the lab. The first thing you do is you just delete everything. So, why wasn't he asked about that? And then, of course, this is something that you've looked into in great detail. There was that conference he attended around that time.
Yep. And, that was the conference where somehow a couple days before, well, actually the first meeting was maybe 2 weeks earlier, but right before the database was taken down, they have this conference, this get together, and part of the conference included Fauci, it included Jeremy Farrar, it included Gao Fu, and excuse me, it included the head doctor, I don't remember his name, for the Gates Foundation. All of those people were party to this meeting. And the whole purpose of the meeting was to get together and what do we do in the case of a global aerosol pandemic? Basically, if you read the description of their document for the meeting, it's a description of COVID. And the answer to that was, so first of all, why are they asking that question? And second of all, their solution to that was the promotion of mRNA vaccines, which couldn't be done absent COVID because they couldn't get past safety trials. So, and then a handful of days after that, the database comes down. And nobody, by the way, nobody's asked to see that database, and nobody has seen it. Daszak shielded the database from the WHO.
Well, some of the folks from Drastic, that online group of randos looking into the origin, who've done so much great work on this,
highly educated randos,
very highly, yeah. They dug up. This is recent. They were able to trace where inquiries of that database had come from, and in the run-up to that database being deleted in September of 2019. There had been a huge spike in inquiries out of Beijing.
Yeah.
It was, notable. I can't read anything into it without knowing more, but that's the whole point. You ask questions. So you ask Fauci about the deletion, and you ask Fauci about this conference that he attended, and what did Gao Fu, the Chinese guy, say? He was there, and what else happened? And, again, nothing on that. And then, of course, a month later, all the diffuse people had a conference at Fauci's office. And that is only the third time that they all got together. So these
Why
are
don't you
Peter
really quickly
Daszak,
explain once again what the diffuse is so
right.
everybody's clear.
So Peter Daszak, Ralph Baric, and Xi Zhengli of the Wuhan lab, those are the main actors, those three. There was a couple of others. There's Linfa Wang on the Chinese side, and there was also that lady, Tony Rock, on the US side. But anyway, those three are the main protagonists. And they came up with this proposal in 2018 to create COVID in a lab. And they created this blueprint for creating COVID in a lab. And we've talked about this before. We don't have to go into that again. But just to say that again, it's not an exaggeration to say it. They had a proposal for making COVID in a lab. The exact feature of COVID, the furin cleavage site at the S1, S2 junction on the genomic sequence, that was their proposal. And that's exactly what COVID looks like. And then the proposal was rejected by the Pentagon. And then that same group met again in 2019 in late 2018. So a few months after the Pentagon rejected, that exact same group met in Wuhan. So Ralph Baric was in Wuhan. That's something else that no one ever talks about. He's always like, oh, this guy in North Carolina got nothing to do with what the Chinese get up to. He was there with those people from Diffuse. And I think this is the most important one, and Fauci wasn't asked about it, the same people showed up again in Fauci's office in October of 2019.
Yeah. Now, why is that timeline important? Well, it's because in October, we have the U.S. Consulate General was sending back reports to the U.S. government saying, hey, there's something going on here. We don't know what it is. It may be I think they termed it as an unusually vicious flu season. But it was clear that what we now know was COVID was already well into the general population. And there's a lot of different data points, and we won't bore you with all of them. But I think both you and I feel pretty comfortable saying that, COVID probably came out sometime in the summer, in July, maybe in August, and then percolated and made its way into the general population. And here we are. So that's what makes these timelines and these meetings so relevant that are taking place on the part of Fauci. We also have the interesting data point where the CEO of Moderna goes to his general manager of production sometime probably in December 2019 for sure, because he said so, but probably early December 2019, goes to him and says, hey, I know you only made 100,000 doses of mRNA vaccine for the Ebola outbreak last year, but guess what? I'm going to need you to ramp up to make 1 billion. This is in 2019 that this is being done. These are, enormous structural plans that change an entire company. He was already engaging in that in 2019. And that's who Fauci signed the agreement with a couple months later, or a month later.
A couple of weeks later. It was January 13th, 2020. Yeah. By the way, he fudges that. So again, GOP. Well, let's talk here in a moment as to why GOP did what they did or didn't do what they didn't do. But before we do that, let's just get through the facts first. So, in his written statement, which was issued the day before he appeared before Congress, Fauci fudged that issue. He kind of, the timeline of when he ordered the mobilization of those Moderna mRNA vaccines, he fudged that because he knows that the true timeline is not good for him. And you and I discovered this, when was it, like a year ago? So in an SEC filing by Moderna, the company, that was just a document buried in a whole bunch of other documents, where it's revealed that Moderna and Fauci decided to do the full mobilization on January 13th. And of course, that date is so incredibly important because it was before anyone knew that there was a problem. And in fact, a day afterwards, on January 14th, the World Health Organization announced that there's no problem at all because this thing does not transmit from human to human. So why did Fauci do that? And he should have been asked about that timeline. As I said, the GOP members had a heads up because they could see from his written statement that he was, well, lying or at a minimum fudging. So that's a huge red flag. And then you go for it. I didn't do that.
No. And there's another thing that's important about that date as well, is because that comes one day after China released the genomic sequence of COVID officially, despite the fact that Fauci and crew had it, at least 2 weeks earlier via Eddie Holmes. And we had a Chinese scientist post the genomic sequence on NIH's own database, and NIH deleted it and waited until China actually made the official determination. And Eddie Holmes himself admitted that he withheld that information at the request of China. So that 13th date is important because it follows right after the 12th. Well, of course, it follows after the 12th. But on the 12th, that's the date that China kind of gave the official, you can kind of go public with this nod, effectively, to Fauci and his scientists.
Right. So then we already did the John Cohen, January 31st. He wasn't asked about that. What was it about the John Cohen article that triggered you to convene this secret teleconference? He blamed the teleconference on Jeremy Farrar, the now head of the World Health Organization's science, whatever, chief scientist, I think he's called.
Former head of Wellcome Trust.
In itself is completely ridiculous. But yeah, this is Wellcome, the pharmaceutical company. They have this ginormous trust with billions and billions to be doled out, similar to what Fauci does. And this is the guy who Fauci says, oh, he actually organized the conference. Well, we know that they both did, but if that's the answer, then you got to go and push him on, well, how do you know Jeremy Farrar? Why do you listen to a British pharmaceutical trust director? What's the deal there?
But also, why were you tied in with Farrar back in September 2019 at the conference we talked about? Because again, that select group of board members, Gao Fu, Fauci, Jeremy Farrar, and again, the head of the Gates Foundation's medical doctor. I should look up his name. I should know it off the top of my head. But why were those four parties working back then at the same time? The same names keep cropping up throughout. And we know it wasn't just Farrar. Fauci basically told Farrar, hey, you handle getting the conference together. I got my hands full over here. And that's what happened. And it was Fauci, Farrar, and Collins. I don't think we should. That was another element here is, Collins has this big, shucks, I'm just a, kind of whatever kind of guy, country bumpkin. And yeah, it's clear that Fauci was leading everything, but I personally think it's a mistake to leave Collins off of the radar because the emails make it very clear that Collins was intimately involved with all of this, including help to edit Proximal Origin. Fauci was running things, but Collins was right there.
Exactly. So now we get to after the secret teleconference. So after February 1st, 2020, we already talked about the NASEM conference, February 3rd, where Fauci was pushing the natural origin, which completely contradicts what he told Congress. Again, he wasn't pushed on that. And then, of course, we get into him stealth editing and basically, driving this proximal fraud paper. So he was asked about that, to be fair, but he wasn't pushed on it. So his answer was, I had nothing to do with that paper. That was other people. And that was it. And we have tons of emails of him reviewing the paper, he was extremely concerned about the mice being mentioned in the paper, the humanized mice. He puts like all these question marks, like, ooh, we obviously sort of he's not happy with that. And guess what? The humanized mice were removed from the paper. Of course, the humanized mice are very, very bad for Fauci because that is what Barrick sent the Wuhan lab. That is advanced Western
That
biotechnology.
ties directly back to the diffuse proposal.
Exactly. And of course, Barrick being Fauci funded, of course, the fact that Fauci enabled the Wuhan lab by giving it the NIH seal of approval, which, to be fair to Barrick, I think if Fauci had not given the Wuhan lab that seal of approval, I don't know. We'd have to ask him, and he might lie about it, whatever. But my hunch is Barrick would not have sent them the mice without that. But again, that's an extremely interesting line of questioning. Never happened. And of course, we have Anderson with a dollar sign. This is how we talked about this before, how they tried to hide his name from FOIA. So Anderson, this proximal fraud author, he thanked Fauci for leading the project. It's an email. We have it, right? So why wasn't, when Fauci lied about, I had nothing to do with proximal origin, why wasn't he presented with all this evidence?
This goes back to my kind of initial comment that the GOP was intentionally unprepared.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So
you and I could have thrown these questions together for the committee in a day. And, that it's the fact that they didn't have this stuff at the ready. I want to mention one other thing before we go there. And that gets back to the diffuse proposal. And the other thing that wasn't touched on was the fact that we now know that there was 15 different federal agencies, representatives from, that were part of the diffuse proposal presentation in 2018. And again, if anybody's actually familiar with the diffuse proposal, it is impossible to look at that and not see that as a blueprint for COVID. So once the virus actually hit, anybody who was there, their first thought's going to be, holy shit, they did it and it got out. And everybody stayed quiet. And there was no reference to the fact that there was the 15 different federal agencies. And the reason that I bring that up just before we move on to this topic is I think that's part of the reason why the GOP is intimidated, maybe, scared. Wenstrup's opening statement certainly struck me as a guy who'd gotten a talking to and was afraid to be aggressive as you would have expected him to be.
I completely agree. I mean, maybe on that last point, before we shift to the sort of the why, is was he even asked about the fuse?
I don't think so. I'm not positive, but I don't. It certainly wasn't a focus if he was asked.
You and I remember the day when it happened, September of 2021.
I think there was one or two references that there was an early proposal, but it was not delved into in any depth.
In particular, why did those diffuse people all show up at NIAID in October of 2019?
Yeah, well, that certainly wasn't touched on.
And when did you first find out about it? When did there's so much to be asked there. Now, I don't mean to digress too much, but this is so important because who knows exactly what they did in September of 2021? Well, I remember that day into September of 2021 when you and I just kind of fell off our chair because the drastic people, huge kudos to them, managed to unearth the diffuse proposal. And that was the day. I mean, I was sort of probably 95% just based on common sense and all the other info we had, the cover up and the diffuser and cleavage site and so on. But I was 100% that day when I saw that thing.
Well, I remember we talked about it. I think both of us were, sort of privately common sense, everything we've seen. We've already seen the cover up from Fauci. Like, of course it's a lab leak. But I think more when we saw that diffuse proposal, it wasn't just us. I was thinking, okay, this should cement it for everybody out in the public. Like, this is the thing that you put in front of them and they can't dispute it. And, that should have been the cementing factor. And instead, everybody went out of their way to not pay attention to it.
Yep. So what do you make of the why? How come the GOP was pretty good? And by the way, you said the lawyer was a bit better, the GOP counsel. Yeah, he was better than the members, but he wasn't good either. I mean, he was it wasn't like what he did with Morans 2 weeks ago, where he really drilled down on details and caught Morans in all kinds of problematic statements and conflicts and so on. So
I would
why?
agree with that. At first, I thought that's what he was doing. I thought he was quietly laying a trap because he was asking a sequence of actually decent questions, and just taking the answers. And I thought, okay, maybe now we're going to go someplace with this. And then it just tailed off. And what my first thought that came into my head was somebody put a leash around him.
Yeah.
Because his questions, if you go back and watch his initial questions, he asked them very quietly, no fanfare, but there were some good questions in there. I really thought, like, hey, maybe a trap is coming here. And then it just stopped. So my take on that was somebody put a noose around him, a leash, and he couldn't proceed any further.
That was my reading as well. In particular, he was trying to be nice, like, "Oh, I really appreciate that," and so on. Yeah, you do that with witnesses from the other side if you cross-examine because you want to kind of put them in a comfortable position and then pounce. But you don't do that with Fauci, and this guy's smart enough to know that you don't do that with Fauci. Fauci's probably one of the most skilled people in the entire world when it comes to lying and dissembling and sort of he's a psychopath on a certain level. He thinks he's smarter than everyone, and to be honest, he sort of looked that way in the hearing.
I think you, no, I know you and I have talked about this enough. We both believe that at a bare minimum, Fauci has sociopathic tendencies. The way he is able to lie. I mean, he really is it's kind of cartoonish, but he is sort of that guy. The evil villain who just wants to experiment and doesn't give a shit about who's hurt by him doing it. That's actually who he is.
So the why, right? So COVID Select, GOP in particular, went after Daszak, and by tweet and in the hearing, and they gave him a hard time, and rightly so. Then they went after Morans, and they gave him a right time, and they actually found out a lot. And Morans stumbled a lot, and it was good.
Morans looked like an idiot. Yeah, it didn't go well.
And now they're going after Peter Hotez, which is another one of these Fauci flunkies. They haven't done the hearing yet. I don't know whether they will, but by tweet they have done. On Twitter. Okay, so they're obviously okay going after Fauci's flunkies, or someone has kind of green lighted that. And by the way, Fauci did throw both Daszak and Morans
under the bus.
But not Fauci himself. The contrast and treatment of Fauci as opposed to his flunkies is huge. So what do you make of it?
Well, I guess, first of all, I agree 100%. It seemed like there was some sort of edict that went out that said, all right, we've agreed that Morans and Daszak can take the hits. You can beat up on Fauci because the public demands it. So you can berate him. But it's going to stop there. That's what it felt like to me, that, he's got to be protected. And I mean, if you're trying to not get to the root of the matter, then Fauci probably does have to be protected. He knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows where all the funding came from. One thing that kind of that exemplifies this is the simple fact that Fauci lied demonstrably and repeatedly, provably so, throughout the entirety of the hearing. Almost every answer was a lie. If the committee wanted to get to the bottom of this, they would be drafting or would have drafted charges of perjury. That hasn't been done. I don't expect it to be done.
It won't be done. But of course, you're absolutely right. It's like they were shackled. They were not allowed to go there. They weren't allowed to take that extra step. So Fauci lies about, when he found out about something, or his, for instance, we talked about proximal fraud, that he had no involvement. So that's a lie. Okay. At that point, you hold up an email and say, "Hey, look, this is what you said. You talked to these guys. You told them what to write. You edited. You read. You were thanked for your role. You have all this sort of stuff going on." And he wasn't confronted with anything like that. So that's exposed. They let him lie about everything, as you said, and then it was just stop. Okay, now. If in a proper, democracy, in a proper country with transparency and accountability and so on, you'd say, okay, now DOJ can take over and prosecute the lie. Obviously, that's not going to happen because no one's going to prosecute this guy. So the best you can hope for is to at least expose the lie in public by holding up the emails. They never did that.
Well, nor did they do the montage, which would have just buried Fauci. I mean, that would have been very powerful, very simple to put together. You wait for the proper moment, you hit play. They didn't do it. So, as we kind of reach the end here, where does this go? I think what we're seeing is the fact that people understand at the congressional level that this thing goes further than Fauci. And that if you scratch Fauci, you get the DOD, you get the intelligence community, you get the 15 federal agencies which were present for the diffuse proposal, you get the federal government. And I think that's fundamentally what's going on here is, this was an utterly unprecedented event. And guess what? The government's got complicity. It was directed by Fauci, but plenty of other people knew about it, and we can't afford to expose this properly. So we're going to rant and rave, and we're going to yell at Fauci. We're probably going to bury Morens and Daszak and maybe Hotez, which wouldn't bother me one bit. Can't stand that guy. But that's where it's going to stop. And I think that's what we saw at these hearings.
I agree, and I think it was entirely planned that way. So for once,
judging from Wenstrup's opening statement, 100%.
Absolutely, and because there's always this question. Well, I've had it for years and years. Are these people just all completely incompetent, or is there more to it? Are they, deliberately incompetent? And I think the fact that the lawyer seemed to be shackled, never followed up, and never really did much. And we have to assume he's competent. We know he's competent because he was very competent with Morens. Same guy, So I think we just have to conclude that this was deliberate, and they knew where the boundaries were. And I agree with you. Wenstrup kind of fenced them in and set the boundaries right at the get-go. Now, isn't he retiring? Didn't he kind of just announce out of nowhere that he's retiring?
Yep.
And we never kind of were able to make sense of that.
Never got a good answer to that. That's happened a few different times, actually, with different key members. Think about the TikTok bill, the guy that promoted that, just announces and takes a job with Palantir, the IC-funded company that just so happens to want to have TikTok taken down. Yeah, we've seen that a few different times. Again, I just would say the two words, intentionally unprepared.
Yeah. How do you think, maybe it's kind of a last point, which just speculation because we don't really know, but how do they get to them? What's the mechanism for instance, I don't think every single member there was told, these are your boundaries and this is what you can do. And if you don't, then this and this will happen. I don't think it goes that deep or that wide. I think everyone is kind of looking at Wenstrup, and Wenstrup is nice. And then everyone knows, we got to be nice. But how does that process get initiated? How does someone, or Johnson as well, the speaker, he's completely folded on everything.
That was the example that leapt right to my mind. Johnson was very overt, right? They literally took him into a skiff, and he comes out, and suddenly he can't enact anything, right? He's scared shitless. My own joke, and I say it, and I don't really mean it as a joke, is that they said, hey, look, isn't this a nice file we have on you? What do you think about it? Johnson walks out knowing that he can't do anything. There's some elements of that's going on. And, there's a few of these people that are much more knowledgeable and can talk with expertise about this situation. And I think if you have those people contained, it kind of spreads throughout. Other people can raise questions and they can pound their chests, et cetera, but they don't have the depth of knowledge to really go anywhere with it. And of course, you also have the congressional hierarchy that if you've got your leaders setting the tenor, for the most part, you're just going to follow along with the lead that they provide. So I think the answer is multifaceted. You talk to a couple of key people that really know this stuff and could do damage, prevent them from doing damage, and you have the tenor set by Wenstrup and it filters down throughout all of Congress.
And a lot of them will probably just be satisfied with the national security excuse, which is sort of the catch-all. You just tell them, you can't talk about this. It's a national security issue. I can't give you any details, but don't do it. And probably 90% of them just fold without even having to push it any further or tell them anything else.
Well, and the whole design of the hearings where you've got 5 minutes, all that's really designed for is to create sound bites that you can send to your constituents in a campaign ad, where you can show that you were, you pound your chest a little bit, that you were berating Fauci. You didn't get to anything. You didn't prove anything, but you can show that you were tough on, tough on Fauci, and that's all that came out of this hearing, in my mind.
Yeah, no, but we still have the lawyer also kind of folding. So obviously there was more to it here than just the
Well, but the
format.
lawyer is easy to get to, right? I mean, all you need is one senior member of Congress saying, "Hey, you can't, you can only ask so much." All you'd have to say is a passing comment. You need, I don't want you going into too great a detail, whatever. He's going to get the message. That's simple.
I think just maybe as a final thought here, it'd be very interesting as a kind of a longer term thing to try and figure out, the exact mechanism. And as you say, it's multifaceted. There's lots of stuff going on, but I think not enough is known. Well, first of all, I think people aren't maybe becoming now a little bit more aware, but aren't so fully aware of that this goes on at all. I think the Johnson example was so like crass, just out there that people did
Guy
start
walks into a
thinking,
skiff with the intelligence community and comes out scared to death.
right. But I think this is worth exploring a bit further. I'd love to know Devin Nunes's thoughts, for instance, on this. So
Yeah.
I don't think anyone ever got to him. So I don't think he could like spill the beans. I think if he could, he would have done that already. Like if he truly knew the details of what was done and who did it and so on. But obviously the game was played with him with these fake ethics investigations and then this and that, and ultimately he retired from Congress. So he'd be a good person to talk to in trying to get to the answer. There's other people as well, Thomas Massey and so on. Maybe by kind of going wide and talking to various people, it might be possible to get a better kind of understanding of what exactly happens. Because I have to admit, I know something happens because suddenly they all fold. Obviously, in this example, no question about it, Fauci was declared off limits and everyone stuck to that. But then why? Why did they all stick to it? And I don't have, I don't have the perfect answer for sure.
Yep. Nunes is is an interesting one. He's somebody we could both reach out to. There's a couple others we could do the same. Maybe that's actually worthwhile, is asking some questions. But at any rate, we both walked away from this hearing shaking our heads and saying, well, looks like, they're trying to put the kind of nail in the coffin, bury it, and that's the end of the day.
Well, let's do that. Let's try and dig a bit further on this kind of more the more general question here. Stay tuned. We won't have it next week, but eventually we'll get there.